The night was heavy with the scent of burning oil and the quiet prayers of the doomed. From the highest dome of Hagia Sophia, the dying light of April 1453 bathed Constantinople in a crimson glow, the same glow that had once been called divine, now trembling on the edge of extinction. Emperor Constantine XI stood upon the city walls, his armor gleaming faintly beneath the torches, eyes fixed on the black sea of tents that stretched to the horizon. Beyond those tents waited the end of an empire, 10 centuries of glory carved in marble and faith, now surrounded by an army that numbered in tens of thousands, led by a 21-year-old conqueror whose ambition burned brighter than the stars. The siege began under skies that seemed to mourn the fate of a civilization. On April 6, 1453, the field surrounding Constantinople transformed into a vast military camp as Sultan Mehmed II's army took its positions. The Ottoman host, numbering over 80,000 men, soldiers, engineers, sappers, and janissaries, filled every stretch of land from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. Their banners rippled like waves, a sea of crescents and green standards fluttering against the wind, while the city's defenders, scarcely 7,000 strong, watched from behind the massive Theodosian walls that had once defied centuries of invaders. To the weary Byzantines, it seemed as though the world itself had turned against them. Constantine XI moved among his people not as a distant monarch but as one of them, sharing in their exhaustion, their hunger, and their fear. He had sent desperate pleas to the West, to Rome, to Venice, to the kingdoms that still called themselves Christian, but aid had come too little and too late. A few hundred Genoese soldiers under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani had arrived, bringing courage and expertise, yet their numbers were a whisper against the storm that approached. Still, within the city, there was a fragile thread of hope. The walls of Constantinople had withstood sieges before, their towering triple layers of stone and moat had earned a reputation of invincibility. Behind them, the Byzantines believed, perhaps they could endure until divine providence intervened. On the other side of those walls, Sultan Mehmed II surveyed the ancient city with a vision that transcended mere conquest. He was only 21, yet his mind was that of an emperor born to remake the world. To him, Constantinople was not simply a fortress, it was destiny itself, the final jewel that would bind his empire together and grant him the title of Caesar in his own right. Each day, he watched as his engineers positioned massive bombards, weapons unlike anything the world had seen before. Crafted by the Hungarian master Orban, these cannons could hurl stone balls weighing half a ton against the city's defenses, their thunder echoing for miles across land and sea. Inside the city, the sounds of war grew nearer. At night, the glow of Ottoman campfires shimmered like stars on earth, and from the ramparts, the Byzantines could hear the distant chants of prayers from an army united in faith and purpose. Every dawn brought a new assault, arrows darkening the sky, drums beating like the pulse of fate itself. Yet Constantine stood firm, knowing that his city was more than stone and mortar. It was the soul of a dying world, and if it were to fall, he would fall with it. As the siege dragged on, Constantinople found itself not only surrounded by enemies beyond its walls but divided by doubt within. The empire that had once been the heart of Christendom now stood fractured by its own faith. Decades of tension between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had left scars that even the threat of annihilation could not easily heal. The memory of the Fourth Crusade, when Latin soldiers had looted and defiled this very city 2 centuries before, still lingered in the hearts of the Byzantines. For many, the arrival of aid from the West felt less like salvation and more like the return of an old betrayal. When Emperor Constantine XI agreed to unite the two churches under papal authority in exchange for Western support, the decision tore the soul of the city in two. In Hagia Sophia, priests conducted joint services meant to symbolize unity, but the incense burned heavy with resentment. Some Orthodox believers refused to attend, calling the emperor's gesture a blasphemy and accusing him of trading their faith for the empty promises of foreign kings. On the streets, Whispers spread like wildfire that God had turned his face from Constantinople because its rulers had knelt before Rome. Even among soldiers manning the walls, tension grew. Some swore they would rather die as true Orthodox Christians than survive as subjects of a false alliance. Yet others, weary and desperate, clung to the faint hope that unity might still summon aid across the sea. Constantine himself bore this turmoil in silence. He understood the depth of his people's hatred and the fragility of their spirit, yet he had no choice. The enemy beyond the walls grew stronger each day, their cannons roaring like divine judgment. Food was dwindling, disease spread in the cramped quarters, and morale wavered with each passing dawn. Still, the emperor refused to let his city crumble from within. He moved from church to church, speaking softly to his people, urging them to hold faith not in politics or doctrine but in one another. In the flickering torchlight, his voice echoed through the broken streets like the last heartbeat of a dying age. But the walls could not muffle the sound of division. Even as the faithful prayed for deliverance, the chasm between Latin and Orthodox deepened, making the city weaker than any cannon could render it. The defenders stood shoulder to shoulder, yet their hearts were split by centuries of mistrust. As the great bells of Hagia Sophia tolled through the smoky air, it became clear that Constantinople was not only besieged by the armies of Mehmed II, it was besieged by its own ghosts. The first thunder of the great cannon shattered the morning stillness like the voice of some forgotten god awakening from centuries of sleep. On the plain outside the Theodosian walls, Sultan Mehmed's engineers had assembled the monstrous bombard, a weapon that defied imagination. Forged in Adrianople by the master gunner Orban, the cannon was cast from bronze so thick that it took weeks to cool, and its barrel stretched longer than the height of 2 men. It required 60 oxen to move and hundreds of men to position, yet when it spoke, even the earth trembled. The first stone ball it hurled struck the outer wall with a sound that seemed to echo through heaven and hell alike. Dust and debris rose in clouds, and though the wall held, the defenders could feel its ancient strength faltering with each terrible roar. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The Ottomans placed smaller cannons alongside the great one, creating a relentless rhythm of destruction that pounded the city's defenses without mercy. The once proud walls of Constantinople, the same walls that had repelled Huns, Avars, and countless other foes, now groaned under the power of this new age of war. The stones cracked and split, towers crumbled into the moats below. Each night, the defenders worked by torchlight to repair the breaches, hauling rubble and timber, mixing mortar with shaking hands. Women and children carried buckets of earth to fill the gaps while priests walked among them, whispering prayers drowned by the distant pounding of metal against stone. From the city's towers, Emperor Constantine XI watched as centuries of history disintegrated before his eyes. He could see Mehmed's army moving with the precision of a single organism, slaves, soldiers, and scholars all united under one will. The young sultan himself rode among them, his black stallion flashing beneath the banners of the crescent moon. To Mehmed, the cannon was not merely a weapon but a symbol of destiny, the instrument by which the ancient world would yield to the new. He called it the throat of hell, and each shot it fired seemed to devour another piece of the old empire. The defenders began to understand that no wall, no matter how sacred or ancient, could withstand the relentless will of invention. The age of stone fortresses and divine protection was dying, replaced by iron, powder, and human ambition. As the nights burned red with fire and the air filled with the stench of smoke and fear, the people of Constantinople realized that the thunder outside their walls was not only the sound of destruction, it was the sound of an era ending. On the night of May 28, 1453, Constantinople lay beneath an unnatural silence. The thunder of cannons had ceased, the clash of swords had fallen away, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that heavy stillness, the people of the city knew what awaited them when dawn came. The Ottoman army was preparing for its final assault, and the defenders, exhausted and broken, could only brace for the inevitable. Emperor Constantine XI walked through the darkened streets one last time, the faint glow of lanterns flickering across shattered stone and empty homes. Every step he took was filled with the weight of centuries, the memory of emperors, saints, and soldiers who had built this city as the heart of the Christian world. Now, he would watch it die. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the once glorious cathedral glowed with candlelight. Thousands had gathered there, nobles, beggars, monks, and children, all seeking refuge not from the enemy's swords but from their own despair. For the first time in generations, Orthodox and Latin Christians stood side by side in prayer. The old quarrels were forgotten, or perhaps simply meaningless now. Priests chanted hymns that trembled through the vast dome, their voices echoing like the final song of a dying world. People wept openly, clutching icons and relics, confessing sins aloud in the hope that God might still hear them before the walls fell. Constantine entered quietly, removing his helmet and kneeling before the altar. He prayed not for victory, for he knew that was beyond reach, but for redemption for his people, his city, and his own soul. When he rose, those around him saw not an emperor but a man stripped of all titles, standing before fate itself. He walked among the congregation, asking forgiveness from his soldiers, his nobles, even from the lowest servants. Many fell to their knees before him, but he lifted them gently, saying that they had all done their duty. Then, with a calm voice, he told them that the time for mourning was over, and the time for courage had come. Before dawn, Constantine mounted his horse and rode to the Mesotychian, where the defenses were weakest. The moonlight glimmered on his armor, now dented and scorched from weeks of battle. He looked once more at the city he had sworn to protect, its towers cracked, its domes darkened by smoke, and whispered a final prayer. As the distant drums of the Ottoman army began to rise, he tightened his sword belt and gave the order no emperor had ever given before, to fight not for victory, but for honor. The dawn of May 29, 1453, arrived with the sky painted in ash and fire. Before the sun had fully risen, the air itself seemed to scream as the Ottoman cannons unleashed their final fury. The ground shook beneath Constantinople, and the ancient walls that had once defied empires finally began to crumble. Smoke rolled across the ramparts, mingling with the cries of men and the clash of steel. The last defenders, bleeding and exhausted, held their ground with desperate courage, their swords flashing in the dim light of morning. Emperor Constantine XI fought among them, indistinguishable from his soldiers, his imperial cloak torn away so that no one might mark him as king or man. He had become both the last emperor and the last warrior of a dying world. When the final breach opened at the gate of St. Romanus, the Janissaries surged forward like a dark tide. The defenders met them with fire and steel, but the force was overwhelming. The roar of the cannons gave way to the sound of human chaos, the ringing of steel, the screams of the wounded, the shattering of faith itself. Constantine fought until his sword broke, then drew another. His guards fell around him one by one, each man dying where he stood. There was no retreat, no surrender, only the grim resolve to meet death before Dishonor. In the midst of the slaughter, someone shouted that the emperor had fallen, but none could say where. Some claimed they saw him cut down near the breach, others that he vanished into the press of battle, his face calm as the storm consumed him. By midday, the banner of the crescent moon rose above the city's towers. Mehmed II entered through the shattered gates, riding in silence as he gazed upon the ruins of what had once been the greatest city in Christendom. The streets ran red, the air thick with the smell of smoke and salt, yet even the young conqueror seemed moved by what he saw. He rode to Hagia Sophia, where the great cathedral now stood silent, its doors broken, its marble floors stained with centuries of faith and a morning's worth of blood. There, he ordered the prayers of Islam to be read, transforming the symbol of Byzantium into the heart of his new empire. And so, after 1,000 years, the city of Constantine became the jewel of the Ottomans, and the Byzantine Empire passed into memory. Yet among those who survived, whispers endured that the last emperor did not die, but vanished beneath his city's stones, waiting for the day when the walls of Constantinople would rise again.